The formal request arrived on a simple datapad carried by a small automated probe that had been launched from the ruins of the council chambers. The probe had traveled through 17 different star systems using commercial shipping routes. To avoid detection by the pirate fleets that now controlled most of Space Captain Minho, received the probe at the outer edge of human space where patrol ships maintained a silent watch over the galaxy that had rejected them. The datapad contained a single message written in standard galactic script, but the words were barely legible, as if they had been written by someone whose hands were shaking. The message was signed by Council Leader Vexstar, though intelligence reports indicated that his crystal form had been severely damaged by stress and his authority over the remaining council members was questionable. The content was a desperate plea for humanity to return to the galaxy and restore the peace that had been lost. The message admitted that the Council's decision to expel humanity had been a mistake driven by fear and prejudice. It acknowledged that the current crisis was the direct result of losing human protection and guidance. It begged for forgiveness and offered to make humanity the dominant species in the galaxy in exchange for their return. Minho read the message 3 times before its full meaning sank in. The proud beings who had once demanded humanity's removal were now offering to become subjects of a human empire. The species that had claimed to fear human dominance were now begging to be dominated. The datapad was transported to Earth under maximum security. The contents were classified at the highest levels, and only a small group of senior officials were allowed to read the desperate plea from the dying galaxy. The weight of the decision that had to be made was enormous. President Nari called an emergency session of the Global Assembly, bringing together representatives from every human nation and colony. The Great Hall was filled with the same people who had voted for the withdrawal 6 months earlier, but the mood was completely different. The intelligence briefings painted a picture of complete galactic collapse. The death toll from the ongoing conflicts had reached over 10 billion beings. The plague had mutated into 31 different strains and was now affecting previously immune species. The economic devastation had reduced most worlds to primitive survival conditions. Foreign Minister Su Jin presented the formal analysis of the Council's request. The alien species are offering us complete control over galactic affairs in exchange for ending their current crisis. They are willing to accept human dominance in all matters of defense, economics, and politics. Debate that followed was intense and emotional. Many representatives argued for mercy, pointing out that billions of innocent beings were dying because of decisions made by their leaders. Others demanded justice, insisting that the galaxy needed to learn the consequences of ingratitude and betrayal. General Kyung Min spoke for the military leadership. Our forces are ready to intervene and restore order to the galaxy. We have the technology, the training, and the experience to end these conflicts quickly. However, we must consider whether we want to take responsibility for species that have already betrayed us. Once the economic advisors presented their analysis of the costs involved, rebuilding galactic civilization would require massive investments of human resources and technology. The financial burden would be enormous, and the benefits to humanity would be questionable given the galaxy's demonstrated hostility. The scientific community was divided between those who wanted to share human medical knowledge to fight the plague, and those who believed that interference would only delay the inevitable collapse. The ethical implications of watching billions die versus risking human lives for ungrateful aliens were debated intensely. The religious leaders offered their perspectives on forgiveness and compassion, but even they were divided. Some argued that mercy was a human obligation, while others maintained that justice required allowing the galaxy to face the consequences of its choices. The discussion continued for days as representatives struggled with the moral and practical implications of the Council's request. The intelligence report showed that the situation was getting worse every hour, with new conflicts erupting and the death toll rising exponentially. Ambassador Daeho was called out of retirement to provide his perspective on the galactic situation. His decades of diplomatic experience made him uniquely qualified to understand the true nature of the crisis and the likelihood of lasting change in alien attitudes. The old ambassador stood before the assembly with the same dignity he had shown in the council chambers 6 months earlier. The Species that expelled us are now offering to surrender their independence in exchange for our protection. This is not a request for partnership or cooperation, but for subjugation, he continued with quiet authority. The galaxy has learned that they cannot survive without human strength, but they have not learned to respect it. They fear us more than ever, but they fear death more than they fear us. This is not the basis for a healthy relationship. The psychological assessments of the alien leadership indicated that their fundamental attitudes had not changed the fear and resentment. President Nari walked through the memorial garden at the new Sol orbital station where monuments honored the human soldiers who had died protecting alien worlds over the past 3 centuries. Each stone marker bore the name of a human who had given their life to keep peace in the galaxy. The garden was quiet and peaceful, but the weight of recent events made every step feel heavy. The latest intelligence reports lay on her desk, showing the complete collapse of galactic civilization. The death toll from the ongoing conflicts had reached over 3 billion beings across hundreds of worlds. The plague had mutated into 23 different strains and was now affecting species that had previously been immune. The economic collapse had reduced most worlds to subsistence level. Survival Nari paused at a monument dedicated to the Battle of Kepler Station, where 200 human marines had died protecting a hegemony colony from raiders. The plant-like beings they had saved had later voted to expel humanity from the Council. Their gratitude had lasted exactly as long as their fear had allowed. Ambassador Dae-ho tended to his garden on Earth, growing flowers that he had collected from distant worlds during his decades of diplomatic service. The blue roses came from the Krill homeworld, the silver lila from hegemony territory, the glowing orchids from Star collective space. Each flower represented a friendship that had been destroyed by fear and prejudice. The retired ambassador received no visitors from the galactic community, no apologies for the injustice of his expulsion, no acknowledgement of the service he had provided, no recognition of the sacrifice humanity had made. The silence from the galaxy was complete and absolute. Dr. Sujin now served as Earth's foreign minister, coordinating the human response to the galactic crisis. Her office received hundreds of intercepted communications from alien species begging for help, pleading for intervention, demanding that humanity return to save them from the chaos they had created. The messages were pathetic in their desperation. Council leader Vexstar had sent 17 different appeals through intermediaries, each one more degrading than the last. Some alien leaders offered to make humanity the ruling species of the galaxy in exchange for protection. Others promised vast payments of rare resources and technology. The most shameful messages came from individual aliens who had worked with humans in the past. Former students of human teachers begged their mentors to return. Alien patients who had been saved by human doctors pleaded for medical assistance. Beings who had been rescued by human soldiers asked for protection from the chaos. All of these messages were reviewed and filed, but none received responses. The human government had made its decision clear. Humanity would not return to the galaxy that had rejected them. The species that had demanded their removal could face the consequences of that choice alone. The intelligence reports showed that the surviving council members were finally beginning to understand the true scope of their mistake. Every crisis that was destroying their civilization could have been prevented with human intervention. Every disaster that was killing millions could have been stopped with human technology. The defensive systems that humans had built were still operational, but the alien species lacked the knowledge to maintain them properly. The medical facilities that humans had established were still functional, but other species could not operate them effectively. The communication networks that humans had created were still intact, but aliens could not repair them. When they failed, the galactic economy had depended on human colonies as major consumers of goods and services. The transportation systems had relied on human engineers for maintenance and upgrades. The medical research programs had been driven by human scientists with superior knowledge and equipment. Most importantly, the peace that had allowed galactic civilization to flourish had been maintained by human strength and diplomacy. The conflicts that were now destroying entire worlds had been prevented by human peacekeepers. The criminal organizations that now controlled major trade routes had been kept in check by human patrol fleets. The Council records were finally being reviewed honestly for the first time in centuries. The analysis showed that every major achievement of galactic civilization during the past 300 years had been accomplished with human leadership or assistance. Every crisis that had been successfully resolved had required human intervention. The voting patterns revealed the true nature of the Council's decision. To expel humanity, the same species that had demanded human removal were now the ones suffering the most from the chaos. They had voted against humanity not because of any real grievance, but because they were afraid of human superiority. The fear had been irrational, and destructive humans had never used their strength to dominate other species. They had never demanded special treatment or privileges. They had never threatened alien worlds or interfered with alien governments. They had simply provided protection and assistance when asked. The irony was that the peace-loving species who had claimed to fear human aggression were now begging for someone to use force against their enemies. The beings who had demanded nonviolence were now desperate for military intervention. The civilizations that had rejected human protection were now helpless against the very threats humans had shielded them from. Captain Minho now served as Fleet Admiral, commanding all human military forces from his flagship at the edge of human space. He monitored the galactic situation through automated surveillance systems that showed the continuing deterioration of alien societies. The reports were devastating. The Krill Confederation had enslaved over 400 million beings and was building a massive military force using their labor. The pirate alliances controlled 60% of the major shipping routes and were demanding tribute from any vessel that wanted to travel safely. The plague had now killed over 5 billion beings and was spreading to new worlds every day. The medical systems that could have contained it were overwhelmed and ineffective. The economic collapse had reduced most civilizations to primitive conditions with widespread starvation and social breakdown. Military analysts reported that the few remaining Council forces were completely inadequate for dealing with the scale of the crisis. They had no unified command structure, no standardized equipment, and no experience with large-scale operations. The species that had strong militaries were using them only to protect their own territories. The most telling statistic was the communication logs every day brought thousands of messages from alien species attempting to contact human space. The messages ranged from formal diplomatic requests to personal pleas from individuals who had worked with humans in the past. All of these communications were monitored and analyzed, but none received responses. The human government had established a complete information blockade preventing any contact with the outside galaxy. The species that had rejected humanity would have to face their fate alone. The psychological impact on the human population was complex. Many citizens felt vindicated by the galaxy's collapse, seeing it as proof that humanity had been essential for galactic civilization. Others felt sorrow for the innocent beings who were suffering because of their leaders' decisions. The military personnel who had served in galactic peacekeeping operations were particularly affected. They had formed friendships with alien colleagues and had taken pride in protecting vulnerable species. Now they watched helplessly as the worlds they had once protected were destroyed by the very chaos they had worked to prevent. The scientific community was divided between those who wanted to share human medical knowledge to help fight the plague and those who believed that the galaxy needed to learn harsh lessons about the consequences of ingratitude. The debates were intense, but the government's policy remained unchanged. The final intelligence assessment was clear. A galactic civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years was ending. The technological infrastructure was failing. The economic systems were destroyed. The political structures were overwhelmed, and the military capabilities were non-existente. Species that had voted to expel humanity were now facing extinction. The beings who had demanded their removal were now desperate for their return. The civilizations that had rejected human protection were now helpless against the forces of chaos and destruction. The galaxy was dying, and everyone knew that only humanity could save it, but the price of salvation would be an admission of the greatest mistake in galactic history. The proud species that had expelled humanity would have to humble themselves and beg for forgiveness. The question that haunted every remaining council member was whether humanity would even listen to their pleas. The silence from human space was total and absolute, giving no indication of what the response might be to any request for help. Admiral Taiwan stood in the command center of the massive space station orbiting Earth, watching dozens of holographic displays that showed the continuing collapse of galactic civilization. The intelligence reports came in constantly through automated monitoring systems that humans had secretly placed throughout the galaxy before their departure. Each report painted a darker picture than the last. The Krill Confederation had now conquered 47 star systems and showed no signs of stopping their expansion. Their military forces had grown stronger by capturing weapons and ships from the worlds they conquered. They had enslaved over 200 million beings and were using them as forced labor to build even more warships. The pirate attacks had evolved from simple robbery to systematic destruction of entire trade networks. Criminal organizations had formed alliances and were operating like military forces. They controlled key shipping routes and demanded tribute from anyone who wanted to travel safely through their territory. The galactic economy was in complete collapse. A plague that had started in the outer colonies had now spread to over 300 worlds. The death toll was approaching 1 billion beings across dozens of species. The medical facilities that remained operational were overwhelmed, and their primitive treatment methods were proving ineffective against the rapidly mutating disease. Taiwan reviewed the intelligence reports with his senior staff officers. The situation was worse than even their most pessimistic projections had predicted. The galaxy was not just experiencing a period of instability, it was undergoing complete societal breakdown that threatened the survival of entire civilizations. Colonel Ng presented the military analysis. The Council's attempts to form a unified defense force have failed completely. They have no command structure, no standardized equipment, and no experience with large-scale operations. The few species that have strong militaries are using them only to protect their own territories. The communication logs showed increasingly desperate attempts by various alien species to contact human space. Diplomatic messages pleading for help, trade proposals offering enormous payments for human assistance, even personal appeals from individuals who had worked with humans in the past. All of these messages were ignored. According to official policy, Captain Jinwoo had been monitoring the refugee crisis from his position at the intelligence center. Millions of beings were fleeing the violence and chaos, but there were no safe destinations left. The Council's refugee assistance programs had collapsed along with everything else, and the displaced populations were dying in overcrowded camps. The refugee ships themselves were becoming targets for pirates and raiders who saw them as easy prey. The defenseless vessels carried desperate families with all their remaining possessions, making them attractive targets for criminals. The few patrol ships that tried to protect the refugees were quickly overwhelmed. Meanwhile, in the council chambers, the atmosphere had changed completely from the confident proceedings that had expelled humanity just 3 months earlier. Council leader Vextar's crystal form had grown dim and cracked under the stress of constant crisis management. His voice had lost its musical quality and now sounded harsh and desperate. The emergency sessions were held daily but accomplished nothing. The council members spent their time blaming each other for the disasters that were overwhelming their civilizations. The species that had voted for humanity's expulsion were now pointing fingers at each other, while the few who had voted against it remained silent. Secretary Morhan attempted to maintain order during the meetings, but the discipline that had once characterized council proceedings was gone. Representatives interrupted each other with angry accusations. Some delegates had stopped attending altogether, while others brought armed guards to protect themselves during the sessions. The proposals that emerged from these chaotic meetings were increasingly desperate and unrealistic. Some species suggested hiring mercenary forces to replace human protection, but there were no mercenary groups large enough or skilled enough to handle galactic-scale security. Others proposed creating new alliance systems, but lacked the trust and cooperation necessary for such arrangements. The most desperate proposal came from the hegemony delegation, who suggested surrendering their remaining territory to the Krill Confederation in exchange for better treatment of their enslaved populations. The proposal was rejected by the other council members, but the fact that it was even considered showed how hopeless the situation had become. Dr. Hyorim worked 18-hour days trying to coordinate medical responses to the spreading plague, but her efforts were hampered by the complete breakdown of interstellar communication and transportation systems. Medical supplies could not be delivered to affected worlds because the shipping routes were controlled by pirates. The research facilities that remained operational lacked the advanced equipment and genetic databases that human medical centers had maintained. The techniques for treating complex diseases that affected multiple species had been developed by human doctors over centuries of research and could not be replicated quickly. The death toll from the plague continued to rise exponentially as it spread to new worlds. The disease had mutated into 17 different strains, each requiring different treatment approaches. The medical infrastructure that had taken centuries to build was crumbling under the pressure of a pandemic that was beyond their capabilities to control. Economic analysts reported that the galactic economy was now in complete freefall. The gross galactic product had dropped by 60% in just 3 months. Unemployment had reached levels not seen since the prehistoric wars between species. Before the Council was formed, entire industries had ceased to exist. The banking systems that had financed interstellar trade were failing as loan defaults reached catastrophic levels. The currency exchange mechanisms that had allowed different species to conduct business had collapsed without the economic stability that human participation had provided. Manufacturing centers that had employed millions of workers were shutting down permanently. The complex supply chains that had connected hundreds of worlds could not function without the security and transportation systems that humans had maintained. The technological civilization that had defined galactic society was reverting to primitive conditions. The most tragic aspect of the crisis was how easily it could have been prevented. The human evacuation had been so thorough and efficient that they had left detailed instructions for maintaining every system they had built. The defensive installations were still functional. The medical equipment was still operational. The trade networks were still intact, but the alien species lacked the knowledge and skills to operate these systems effectively. Human technology was too advanced for most species to understand. Human procedures were too complex for alien administrators to follow properly. Human standards were too high for other beings to maintain. The irony was becoming clear to everyone in the galaxy. The same intellectual and technological superiority that had made other species fear humanity was exactly what was needed to keep galactic civilization functioning. Without human oversight and maintenance, the advanced systems that supported billions of lives were failing. Captain Salmi commanded one of the few remaining council patrol ships trying to maintain some semblance of order in the chaos. Her vessel, the New Dawn, was escorting a convoy of refugee ships toward what was supposed to be a safe haven, but intelligence reports indicated that their destination had been overrun by raiders. The mission was hopeless, but Salmi and her crew continued anyway, because there was nothing else they could do. The galaxy they had known was gone, destroyed by the same fear and prejudice that had driven humanity away. The beings who had demanded human removal were now paying the price for their decision. The communication channels that had once carried messages of cooperation and friendship between species now carried only distress calls and pleas for help. The proud civilization that had spanned the galaxy was dissolving into primitive warfare and chaos. The worst part was the knowledge that somewhere in human space, Admiral Taiwan and his people were watching it all happen. They had the power to stop the destruction, to restore order, to save millions of lives, but they had been rejected by the very beings they could save. The council members who remained knew that their decision to expel humanity had been the greatest mistake in galactic history, but their pride prevented them from admitting it publicly. The fear that had driven them to reject human protection now paralyzed them from asking for human help. As the 4th month of the crisis began, the surviving council members faced a terrible choice. They could continue to watch their civilization die, or they could swallow their pride and beg the humans to return. The galaxy was dying, and only humanity could save it. 3 weeks after the last human ship had crossed into human space, the first crisis struck the galactic community. The Krill Confederation had been expanding their territory slowly for decades, but human peacekeeping forces had always prevented them from taking aggressive action against their neighbors now with no human intervention to stop them. The Krill military launched simultaneous attacks on 3 star systems belonging to the peaceful hegemony. The attacks were swift and brutal. Krill battle fleets surrounded the hegemony worlds and began orbital bombardments that destroyed cities and killed millions of innocent civilians. The plant-like hegemony people had no military tradition, and their few defensive ships were destroyed. Within hours of the first assault, the Krill forces landed on the planets and began enslaving. The survivors' emergency sessions were called in the council chambers, but the response was chaotic and ineffective. The council had no military forces capable of stopping the Krill advance. Their peacekeeping fleet consisted of lightly armed patrol ships designed for ceremonial duties, not actual combat. The few species that had strong militaries were too far away to respond quickly or were unwilling to risk their own forces. Council leader Vexstar stood before the emergency assembly, his crystal form flickering with stress and exhaustion. The attack on our hegemony friends is a tragedy that demands immediate action. However, our military advisors inform us that a direct intervention would require forces and capabilities that we do not currently possess. We must consider diplomatic solutions to this crisis. The diplomatic solutions failed completely. The Krill ignored all ceasefire demands and continued their expansion into hegemony territory. Within 6 weeks, they had conquered 12 star systems and enslaved over 50 million plant beings. The hegemony government sent desperate pleas for help to anyone who would listen, but no one had the power to challenge the Krill military machine. The second crisis came even faster than the first. Space pirates and criminal organizations had been kept in check for centuries by human patrol fleets that maintained security on the major trade routes. Now, those routes were completely undefended and became hunting grounds for every outlaw group in the galaxy. Captain Sol Key of the merchant vessel Golden Fortune was transporting medical supplies to a colony world when her ship was attacked by raiders. The pirates had new weapons and ships that were clearly military-grade equipment stolen from abandoned depots. The attack was savage and professional, leaving no survivors and no trace of the cargo. Similar attacks occurred daily across the galaxy. Merchant ships disappeared without sending distress signals. Entire trade convoys vanished between star systems, leaving only debris fields and the occasional escape pod. The galactic economy began to collapse as shipping companies refused to risk their vessels on routes that had become death traps. The third crisis was medical, and it spread faster than anyone could have predicted. A plague had broken out on several worlds in the outer Rim colonies. The disease affected multiple species and seemed to be mutating rapidly to overcome natural immunities. The symptoms were horrific, causing organ failure and death within days of infection. Dr. Hyorim had been the head of the Galactic Medical Research Council for 20 years. She had voted against humanity's expulsion, knowing that human medical knowledge was far superior to anything other species possessed. Now she faced a pandemic that was spreading across dozens of worlds, and she had no way to stop it. The human medical facilities had been the most advanced in the galaxy. Their genetic research laboratories had developed treatments for diseases that other species considered incurable. Their doctors had techniques for surgery and healing that seemed almost magical to alien observers. All of that knowledge and equipment was now gone. Dr. Hyorim worked desperately with her remaining staff to develop treatments for the plague, but their efforts were failing. The disease was too complex and too aggressive for their limited capabilities. Every day brought reports of new outbreaks and rising death tolls. The medical infrastructure that had taken centuries to build was crumbling without human support. The economic collapse accelerated as panic spread through the galactic markets. Human colonies had been major purchasers of goods from hundreds of different worlds. Their sudden absence created a massive drop in demand that crashed entire industries. Unemployment soared as factories closed and trade networks collapsed. Mining operations that had sold rare minerals to human colonies found their markets gone overnight. Agricultural worlds that had supplied food to human settlements were left with massive surpluses. They could not sell. Manufacturing centers that had produced goods for human consumers shut down their production lines and laid off millions of workers. The effects rippled through every aspect of galactic society. Transportation systems that had been maintained by human engineers began to fail. Communication networks that had relied on human technical support started experiencing outages. Power generation facilities that had been upgraded with human technology began having catastrophic breakdowns. Most disturbing of all was the complete silence from human space. Long-range sensors showed human ships moving in organized patterns within their own territory, but they responded to no communications from the outside. The humans had not just withdrawn from council space. They had withdrawn from the galaxy entirely. Trade representatives who tried to establish contact with human worlds found their messages ignored. Diplomatic envoys who approached human space were turned away without explanation. Even emergency distress calls from ships in danger near human territory received no response. The humans had made themselves completely unreachable. The silence was more frightening than any threat or demand would have been. It meant that humanity had truly abandoned the galaxy and all the beings in it. The species that had demanded their removal now faced the reality of what the galaxy was like without human Protection Council meetings became increasingly desperate as crisis after crisis overwhelmed their ability to respond. The Krill Confederation continued their expansion unopposed. Pirates controlled most of the major shipping lanes. The plague spread to new worlds every day. Economic collapse threatened the survival of entire civilizations. Ancient enemies who had been kept peaceful by human diplomacy resumed their bitter conflicts. The hegemony and the Star Collective had been allies for 2 centuries under human mediation, but now they began fighting over refugee settlements and resource allocations. Their conflicts escalated quickly into open warfare. The Council's own security forces proved completely inadequate for dealing with the scale of the crisis. They had been designed for crowd control and ceremonial duties, not military operations against organized enemies. Their training was minimal, their equipment was outdated, and their experience was limited to dealing with minor disturbances. Secretary Morhan attempted to coordinate a response to the multiple crises, but found that the Council had no systems in place for handling such emergencies. For 3 centuries, humans had been the ones who responded to threats, maintained peace, and solved problems. The Council itself had become dependent on human capabilities without realizing it. The realization slowly dawned on the Council members that every period of peace and prosperity in recent galactic history had been maintained by human strength. Every crisis that had been prevented, every conflict that had been resolved, every disaster that had been managed had been due to human intervention. Emergency powers were granted to military leaders, but there were no effective military leaders left. The few species that had maintained strong armed forces were either too distant to help or were using their strength to protect only their own territories. The Council had no unified command structure and no experience with large-scale military operations. The voting records were reviewed and a terrible truth emerged. The same species that had voted to expel humanity were now the ones demanding military intervention to protect them. The beings who had claimed to fear human aggression were now begging for someone to use force against their enemies. Within 8 weeks of humanity's departure, the galactic civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years was collapsing. The technological infrastructure was failing. The economic systems were destroyed. The military capabilities were non-existent, and the political structures were overwhelmed by crises. They could not handle the council chambers that had once been filled with proud representatives from hundreds of worlds, now echoed with desperate pleas for help from the few delegates who still attended meetings. Many species had withdrawn their representatives to focus on protecting their own worlds. Others had been conquered or destroyed entirely. The irony was not lost on the surviving council members. The very qualities that had made them fear humanity's strength, decisiveness, willingness to use force when necessary, were exactly what was needed to save galactic civilization, but those qualities were gone, taken away by their own fearful decision to reject the only species capable of protecting them. Captain Minho stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Starlight, watching the endless darkness of space through the massive viewing windows. His ship was one of 50 human vessels patrolling the outer rim of council space, keeping trade routes safe from pirates and raiders. The bridge crew worked quietly at their stations. monitoring communications and scanning for threats, but today felt different than any other day in the past 3 years. The message came through on the emergency channel. Reserved for only the most critical communications. Minho read it twice before the full meaning sank in. Humanity had been expelled from the Galactic Council. All human military units were ordered to withdraw from Council space immediately. All human colonies and outposts were to be evacuated within 30 days. The message was signed by Ambassador Daeho himself. Lieutenant Dongsu looked up from his communications console. Captain, we are receiving similar reports from all human vessels in the sector. The news is spreading through the fleet faster than official channels can carry it. Minho nodded slowly and activated the ship-wide communication system. Attention all crew members, this is your captain speaking. We have received word that the Galactic Council has voted to expel humanity from their organization. We are ordered to return to human space immediately. This is not a drill. Prepare the ship for immediate departure. The bridge crew exchanged glances, but no one spoke. There was no anger in their faces, no surprise, no protest. They had all served long enough to know that this day might come. The galaxy had always feared human military strength, even while depending on it for protection. Now that fear had finally overcome their need for security on Earth, President Nari walked through the corridors of the Global Assembly, building, her footsteps echoing in the marble halls. She had been in emergency meetings for the past 8 hours since the news arrived from the Council chambers. The representatives from every human nation had gathered to discuss their response to this unprecedented situation. The great assembly hall was filled with voices, speaking in dozens of languages, but all saying the same thing. The galaxy had rejected humanity after 3 centuries of service, sacrifice, and protection. The betrayal was complete and absolute. The beings they had saved, the worlds they had defended, the peace they had maintained, all forgotten in a moment of fear and cowardice. Minister Haiyan Wu from the Asian Federation stood to address the assembly. The motion before us is simple and clear. If the galaxy no longer wants our protection, then we will withdraw completely. We will bring home every human citizen, every soldier, every diplomat, every scientist. We will leave Council space exactly as we found it 300 years ago. The vote was unanimous. 500 representatives from every corner of Earth voted to approve the complete withdrawal of humanity from galactic affairs. There would be no angry speeches, no demands for explanations, no attempts to change the Council's decision. They would simply leave quietly and with dignity. Engineer the Jinn received the evacuation orders at her workstation on orbital platform Delta 7. She supervised the construction and maintenance of defensive systems throughout the outer colonies. Her team had built the shield generators that protected merchant vessels from cosmic radiation. They had installed the early warning systems that detected pirate attacks before they could succeed. They had created the communication networks that kept isolated worlds connected to galactic civilization. Now all of that work would be abandoned. The evacuation protocols were clear. Take only personal belongings and essential supplies. Leave all equipment and installations in working order. Transfer all technical data to local governments. Complete the withdrawal within the specified timeframe. Jin looked around the engineering bay where she had worked for the past 7 years. Her team of 30 humans had maintained the defensive systems for this entire sector of space, keeping hundreds of worlds safe from external threats. Now they would pack their few personal items and leave everything else behind. The withdrawal began immediately. Human colonies throughout Council space received identical messages: pack essential items only, prepare for immediate evacuation. Transport ships are en route. Your new assignment will be provided upon arrival in human space. The tone was professional and calm, but everyone understood the underlying message. They were going home because they were no longer wanted. Dr. Sangmi ran the medical research facility on New Geneva Station. Her team had developed cures for 17 different alien diseases over the past decade. Their work had saved millions of lives across dozens of species. The research center contained the most advanced medical equipment in the galaxy, and their genetic databases held the keys to treating countless conditions that affected non-human biology. The evacuation order was specific: leave all research data accessible to local authorities. Ensure all medical equipment remains functional. Complete any life-saving procedures currently in progress. Transfer all patients to alternative care facilities. Dr. Sangni read the instructions to her staff of 45 human doctors and researchers. We have 3 days to complete the transfer of all our research. The local medical authorities will need detailed instructions for operating our equipment. We must ensure that our patients receive proper care after we leave. This is not about punishment or revenge. This is about maintaining our professional standards. Even as we depart, the evacuation ships began arriving within hours of the expulsion announcement. Massive transport vessels designed to carry entire populations appeared at every human colony and outpost. The ships were efficient and well organized, but their presence made the reality of the situation undeniable. Humanity was leaving the galaxy forever. Captain Jinne commanded one of the evacuation fleets. Her ships moved from system to system, collecting human personnel and their families. The process was methodical and complete. Every human citizen was accounted for. Every piece of personal property was carefully cataloged and transported. Every family was kept together during the journey home. At each stop, Jinne witnessed the same scene. Human workers would complete their final tasks, transfer their responsibilities to local authorities, and board the transport ships without complaint or protest. They left behind advanced technology, functional infrastructure, and years of accumulated knowledge, all given freely to the beings who had just rejected them. The most remarkable aspect of the withdrawal was what humanity chose not to take. The medical centers they had built continued operating under local management. The defensive systems they had installed remained active and functional. The food distribution networks they had established kept working without interruption. They took nothing that had been created for the benefit of alien species. Teacher Kyung-ho had spent 15 years educating young aliens on the frontier world of Kepler 442b. His students came from 6 different species, and he had developed specialized teaching methods for each type of biology and psychology. The school he ran was the only educational facility for 300 light years in any direction. On his final day, Kyung-ho completed his planned lessons exactly as he had for the past 15 years. His students from the insectoid krill species worked on mathematics problems, while his plant-like hegemony students studied galactic history. The young star collective energy beings practiced forming stable matter constructs under his guidance. When the school day ended, Kyung-ho gathered his personal belongings and prepared to leave. The local government officials who came to take over the school found detailed lesson plans for the next 6 months, comprehensive student records, and carefully organized educational materials. Everything needed to continue the school's operation without interruption. The withdrawal was completed ahead of schedule in just 23 days. Every human colony, outpost, research station, diplomatic mission, and military base in council space was evacuated. The process was so efficient and thorough that many alien worlds did not realize the humans were gone until several days after their departure. The last human ship to leave council space was Admiral Taewan's command vessel, the Harmonies, and he had overseen the final phase of the evacuation, ensuring that no human citizens or equipment were left behind. As his ship crossed the boundary into human space, he activated the communication system one final time. This is Admiral Taewan. Of the human fleet, all personnel have been successfully evacuated from council space. All facilities have been transferred to local authorities. All defensive systems remain operational and functional. The withdrawal is complete. We are going home. The message was transmitted on all frequencies so that every species in the galaxy would know that humanity had honored their commitment to leave peacefully. There were no threats, no warnings, no promises of revenge, just a simple statement that the job was done and humanity was returning to their own space. As the Harmonies entered human territory, the communication screens went dark. Humanity had withdrawn completely from galactic affairs. The species that had demanded their removal were now entirely on their own to face whatever challenges the galaxy might bring. The massive doors of the Great Council Chamber opened with a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the vast space. Ambassador Daeho walked through those doors with slow, steady steps, his black diplomatic uniform pristine and his face showing no emotion. Behind him walked 3 other human representatives, each carrying data tablets and official documents. The Chamber was enormous, bigger than any sports stadium on Earth, with curved walls that reached up into shadows above them. Hundreds of alien beings sat in floating seats arranged in perfect circles around the central speaking platform. Some aliens looked like giant insects with multiple eyes, others resembled walking trees with bark-like skin and swaying branches instead of arms. There were creatures made of pure energy that flickered like living lightning and beings that looked like living rocks with glowing crystals. For Feisteho had been to this chamber many times over the past 20 years. He had stood on that same platform to receive medals for human bravery during the Centauri colony rescue. He had given speeches about peace and cooperation. He had signed treaties that brought new worlds into the galactic community, but today felt different. The air itself seemed heavy with tension, and the usual friendly chatter between different species was replaced by uncomfortable silence. In the highest floating seat sat Council Leader Vextar, a being that looked like a massive crystal sculpture that had somehow come to life. His body was transparent blue with veins of silver light running through it. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. But today, even his musical voice carried an edge of coldness that made everyone in the chamber feel uneasy. Young diplomat Sujin sat in the human observer section, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had worked under Daeho for 5 years and had never seen him look so calm before such a serious situation. She knew that calmness was not peace, but the quiet before a terrible storm. Sujin had read all the documents. She knew what the council was planning to do, and she also knew that Daeho knew it too. The formal proceedings began with the traditional greeting in the old galactic language. Then Vextar switched to standard council speech so everyone could understand. His crystal form pulsed with brighter light as he began to speak. Citizens of the galaxy, we gather today to address serious concerns about the human species and their continued membership in our peaceful council. For 300 years, humans have been part of our great alliance. They have participated in our decisions, shared our knowledge, and contributed to our mutual prosperity. However, recent events have forced us to question whether humans are truly compatible with our values of peace, harmony, and non-violence. Daeho stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Vextar, but his expression remained neutral. He had expected this speech, had prepared for it, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. The accusations were carefully worded, but everyone in the chamber understood their meaning. Humans were being called too dangerous, too aggressive, too different from the other peaceful species. The charges were read aloud by Secretary Morhan, a slug-like being whose voice was wet and bubbling. The first charge was excessive use of force during the recent Omega Sector crisis, where human military units had fought against space pirates who were attacking civilian colonies. The second charge was failure to seek council approval before taking military action. The third charge was intimidation of other species through displays of superior military technology. Charge was technically true but stripped of all context. During the Omega Sector crisis, human ships had arrived first because they were already patrolling that region. They had not waited for council approval because waiting would have meant the deaths of millions of innocent civilians. They had used their superior weapons because anything less would have failed to stop the pirates who were using stolen military equipment. Sujin watched the faces of the alien representatives as the charges were read. She saw fear in their eyes, but also something worse. She saw relief. Many of these beings had been saved by human intervention at some point in their history. Their worlds had been protected by human soldiers. Their people had been healed by human doctors. Their children had been taught by human teachers. But now they were glad to have an excuse to push humanity away. When the charges were finished, Daeho was invited to respond. He stepped forward to the central platform and activated the speaking device that would carry his voice throughout the chamber. He looked up at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at him and began to speak in a voice that was steady and clear. Honored members of the council, I stand before you not to deny the charges, but to provide the context that has been deliberately removed from them. Yes, human forces used overwhelming power against the pirates in Omega Sector because anything less would have failed to save the 3 million civilians who were about to be killed or enslaved. Yes, we acted without waiting for council approval because the council approval process takes 6 hours and those civilians had 6 minutes. Before the pirates reached them, yes, we displayed our military capabilities. Because showing strength prevented the need to use paused and looked directly at several specific aliens in the chamber. Representatives of the Krill Confederation, do you remember when your colony ships were attacked by plasma storms and human rescue vessels pulled 40,000 of your people from burning ships? Representatives of the hegemony, do you remember when the plague swept through your homeworld and human doctors worked for 18 months without rest to develop a cure that saved your entire species? Representatives of the Star Collective, do you remember when your trade routes were being destroyed by raiders and human patrol ships restored safety to your merchant fleets? The chamber fell completely silent. Many of the aliens Deho had addressed looked away, unable to meet his steady gaze. Sujin noticed that some were actually trembling, their fear of confronting the truth almost as strong as their fear of humanity itself. Deho continued speaking, but his voice remained calm and professional. We have never asked for payment for our help. We have never demanded special treatment. We have never used our strength to control or dominate other species. We have simply done what we believed was right, protecting those who could not protect themselves and keeping peace in a galaxy that seems determined to destroy itself. But we understand the message you are sending today. You fear our strength more than you value our friendship. You would rather face chaos and death than admit you need our protection. You have decided that feeling safe from us is more important than actually being safe from real threats. The voting began immediately after Deho finished speaking. Each species had one vote, and there were over 800 species in the council. The results were displayed on massive screens throughout the chamber as each vote was counted. 734 species voted to expel humanity from the council. 61 species voted against expulsion. 5 species abstained from voting. The final tally appeared in glowing numbers that seemed to burn themselves into the chamber walls. Motion passed. Humanity expelled from Galactic Council. Effective immediately. Vexstar rose from his seat and his crystal form pulsed with official authority. By the power invested in this council by the founding charter of galactic civilization, humanity is hereby expelled from membership. All human representatives must leave council space within 30 standard days. All human colonies, military bases, and research stations in council territory must be evacuated. This decision is final and cannot be appealed. Ho nodded slowly and began gathering his papers. He moved with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the proceedings. Behind him, the other human representatives also collected their materials in silence. Sujin watched from the gallery as her mentor and teacher prepared to leave the chamber that had been his second home for 20 years. As the human delegation walked toward the exit, many of the alien representatives looked uncomfortable. Some seemed to want to say something, to apologize or explain, but none found the courage to speak. The chamber that had been filled with tension was now filled with an even more oppressive silence. Just before reaching the doors, Deho stopped and turned back to face the assembly. His voice carried clearly through the chamber without amplification. One final thought, honored members, in your haste to remove what you perceive as a threat, you may have removed the only thing standing between you and actual threats. We will respect your decision and leave peacefully. But do not expect us to return when you discover what the galaxy is like without human protection. The doors closed behind the human delegation with the same rumbling sound they had opened with, but this time the sound seemed final, like the closing of a chapter in galactic history. The remaining council members sat in uncomfortable silence, each wondering if they had just made the greatest mistake in the history of their civilization.